They found a river. There, at the bottom of the mountain, where the air was chilly, the fog was rolling out from a wall of foliage. The road that brought them down veered to the left, continuing to hug the base of the mountains. Standing motionless, having caught the sound of trickling water, they listened to make sure. Regarding one another, Imala grinned, and they left the road to slip into the forest. Claire let Imala go first. Once they gave themselves to the curtains of leaves and blankets of tall grass, coated with moisture, every step was a guess. Imala allowed the greenery to brush against her, but Claire knew what was happening. The fog prevented her from seeing it, yet she had witnessed it before. How Imala would roll her shoulders with every moment of contact, duck down, and then arch her back to let a grouping of leaves tumble down the slope she created. How she dropped her heels upon the ground first, and then shaped the rest of her foot into a crescent for a smooth transition to her toes. Because of the fog, Claire received each branch or gathering at the last second, just catching slight movement from them in Imala's wake. That was all she had to go on for her so-called prisoner's presence, maybe less than 2 feet ahead. For Imala, she knew those movements were more than habit now. They were a lifestyle. For herself, she simply brushed the bushes and low-hanging limbs aside. They weren't trying to hide from anybody. Thankfully, their trip through the milky vegetation lasted but a few seconds. Imala stepped out onto the bank of the river and then stepped to the side, giving Claire a place to emerge. The fog hovered just above their ankles, but they could see the surface of the water. There was a thin break in the forest canopy, running above the river. The moonlight was absorbed by the floating haze, turning the water a deep, dark blue, capturing the shapes of the currents in quick flashes of white. "Is flowing," Claire began, as she and Imala turned their heads to the right. "Away." "Yeah," Imala agreed, and then looked up and to the left. Gazing toward the tops of the overhead trees, she continued, "The mountains start curving deeper into the countryside, since we're still kind of close to them." "Right," Claire responded. "It could be coming from the base." "We follow it right to the source," Imala said. Claire extended her hand upriver. "Lead the way." Imala stared at her a moment, and then smirked as she walked past. "Think I'll try to escape?" She broke into a trot. "Actually," Claire said, keeping pace behind her, "I'm using you as bait." Imala tilted her head back, emitting a quick bark of laughter. The bank was a narrow stretch of mush and stone between the bordering forest and the edge of the water. They followed its slight deviations, having to leap back into the bushes whenever a large boulder blocked their way, or the bank had dipped down, giving the river a hole to fill. The fog was getting thicker, and so Imala slowed down. When she came to a stop, Claire thought she knew why. The first thing to spot was the source of light sitting low to the ground. Still a distance away, she assumed it was a lantern. No way would an open flame that small be able to compete with all this moisture. They were too far away to make out anything but a blotch of orange light in the haze. What threw her off the most was where it sat. Either the river had curved to the left and it was on the opposite bank, or it was hanging from some post right in the middle of the river. Whatever the case, it was stationary, not sitting upon the edge of a boat that bobbed slightly with the currents. The little fishing boat was much closer. She and Imala could actually see it lying upside down, half on the bank, half in the water. She eased up behind Imala and whispered, "Somebody's place?" "Don't know," Imala responded. They moved forward, passing the overturned boat. The river did turn slightly to the left, and now that they were squatting opposite the source of light, it was indeed a lantern. It was sitting at one end of what looked like a small, rickety dock running parallel with the bank. Not even a foot separated the underside of the boards from the surface of the water. They would have assumed this structure had been long abandoned, if not for the lantern, and the shack revealed under its glow. "Do people still live this far out?" Imala whispered. What do you mean, still? Claire whispered back. Neither one took their eyes from the building. Well, Imala began, how much did you get briefed on this area? Just enough, Claire answered. I wasn't supposed to be here long. Why? What do you know about this place? Imala snickered. That even though both sides of the mountain belong to one country, hostilities are still a thing. Even though we're on the winning side? Claire asked. That's the thing, Imala said. Some of the losers are way too bitter. They don't have the power to rebel, but those who can't help themselves, well, they like to cross over the mountain and cause trouble. They don't stray all that far into this side, though. Mainly, they like to cause trouble for those who happen to travel out this way, lying in wait for caravans about to climb the mountain. They even once dropped a bunch of boulders onto the road. Soldiers from this side had to clear them away. So there used to be small villages this far out or something? Claire asked. Imala nodded toward the shack. Places like this, farms and such, but after the attacks became too frequent, and since they could never catch the guys, people just decided to move further away into the larger towns. Watching the small flame inside the lantern, Claire commented, Guess that's a way to keep watch or something. Imala looked at her. Good thing we're experts at hiding. She nudged Claire with her elbow. There was no light peeking between the boards crossing over the two windows facing the river. Claire had to remind herself that most likely someone lived in that shack, that someone chose to live this way. She and Imala moved on. They would have seen the larger shack on the opposite bank when going into another turn to the right, but the fog was still thick. Claire was the one to see it, trying to focus ahead when the front of the building reflected some of the moonlight off the fog. The pale blue surface caught her attention. A second later, Imala stopped. Claire would have run into her, but she sensed Imala's proximity and paused, looking ahead. They were a few feet away from the side of another shack. The old wood was glistening with droplets of moisture where the surface wasn't ravaged by streaks of mold. The back end of the foundation, sitting upon the slope of the bank, was sunken into the mud. Tall grass and shrubs had begun the slow devouring of the old material. Being this close, they would have thought to hear noises from inside, but when Claire looked across the river at the other shack, she muttered, I'm guessing everyone is asleep. Again, Imala replied, glancing back at Claire. Lucky for us. Her grin shrank inward, and both their eyes went wide to the sound of creaking metal hinges. They jerked toward the river, seeing an orange glow swelling from the front of the shack next to them. Like the other two, it had a worn-out dock for a porch. The fog over the water reflected light back toward the shack, casting a beam toward the bank. Claire and Imala hurried and pressed themselves against the side of the building. The orange streak angled away from them, and as they heard footsteps walking across that porch, heading upriver, the light swept further outward until fading away. Once the person left the porch, their steps squished and slopped along the bank. Claire waited until the sounds drifted further before she whispered, Looks like someone's up at a late hour. Someone small, Imala said. Probably a woman, and she's either wearing really thin shoes or she's barefooted. Wonder where she's going, Claire said, turning her head toward the front of the shack. Considering a moment, Imala then asked, Want to ask her where this river leads? Claire turned back to her. Because of the shadows, Imala couldn't see the look of disapproval on her face, but she sensed it nonetheless. She wondered if Claire could see the smile growing across her own face. Might save us some time, Imala offered. Claire looked away from her, pointing her hood downriver. She sighed, lowering her head. Imala suppressed a snicker. Turning back to her, Claire whispered, I'll leave the timing up to you. Understood, Imala squealed in a hushed tone. They separated, Imala dashing for the back of the shack, Claire heading toward the front. Before she stepped up onto the dock, she pressed herself against the wall and looked across at the other shack. It sat silent and tucked away into the fog. All she could see of it was the front wall. If anyone happened to be looking this way between the boards nailed across the windows, she wouldn't be able to know that. The person who left this shack didn't exactly try to cloak their presence, but was the sound of a worn-out set of hinges enough to rouse the neighbors from slumber? Or was this late-night activity commonplace? Poking her head around the corner of the building, she peered down the length of the dock. Spotting the source of light they saw before, the person was holding a lantern down near their feet. They had reached a hill along the bank. She wouldn't have been able to see the set of stairs if it weren't for that small light. The person was leaning forward, using their free hand to grab onto the steps further up and pull themselves to the top of the hill. Claire placed one foot upon the dock and then brought herself up. Because of the thickness of her boots, she didn't hurry to the other end, but she walked across, careful how she placed each step, watching the person as they finished their climb. Once at the top, they disappeared through the bushes, and the faint orange glow from their lantern receded from the hill. Picking up her pace, she hopped that last stretch of the porch and landed into the mud. Instead of a splat, she managed a muffled slurping noise that could have been mistaken as one of the river currents. Then she hurried along the bank and reached that set of stairs. From what she could see under the reflected moonlight, the wood was already rotten and brittle. The moisture, combined with the surrounding growth, had all but swallowed the structure, turning the stairs into mulch and reshaping them as mere footholds into the side of the hill. No wonder the person climbed them the way they did. She mimicked their movements, using both hands to pull herself up. Hunching at the top, she found the lantern again. The hill descended with a more gradual slope, ending at a grouping of trees. Because they were standing along the edge of the bank, the tops of their roots were exposed under the person's light. From what Claire could tell, the bank was above the surface of the river here. The bordering foliage made a quick reach for the water. One of the trees was leaning out over the river, creating a curtain with its low-hanging branches, preventing her from seeing most of the structure on the other side and a distance ahead. She only knew about the building because of the light escaping the windows along the front. The fog absorbed most of the glow, but a portion of the water's surface near the bank rippled with orange circles and waves. Easing forward, staying low, she perched at the top of the slope, trying to get a better view of that building. It was larger than the shacks she and Imala had come across, and was sitting further back from the edge of the raised bank. Was that where this person was going? With all that light, surely there were others within. The windows weren't obstructed by boards nailed across them, but her view was still limited. She eased down the slope, not to get a better perspective, but because the person she and Imala were following had reached the grouping of trees. Holding the lantern out ahead of them, their hurried pace was forced to an almost stop, while trying to achieve a secure footing. Grateful to be able to catch up, Claire was hoping Imala was about to pounce. If ever there was a time to corner this person, it would be there among the trees. Nearing the bottom of the slope, she slowed down, staying hunched among the knee-high grass. So far, she hadn't given herself away. The person ahead was still occupied with each step upon the mangle of roots below them. Keeping the lantern low and ahead, they used their other hand to keep themselves braced against the nearest tree trunk. Claire was several yards out when she knelt down and waited. Glancing occasionally toward the thick foliage on the left, she wondered at which point Imala would act. As vulnerable as this person was now, surely Imala wasn't blind to the opportunity. That was, unless Imala wasn't here anymore, having used this opportunity to escape and find Samson by herself. Surely not, Claire thought. Even if Imala had attempted to escape their agency, the two of them had known each other for years now. If anything, she figured Imala would try to convince her to flee as well. But if not, and Claire was now on her own again, would she have to confront this person herself? She could just follow the river as per the original plan and leave this person alone. She scoffed under her breath at her ignorance toward Imala's current status. Focusing ahead, the person had made it through the gathering of trees. Now, on the other side, they didn't pick up their previous urgency, though she could tell they were walking at a brisk pace. Huffing, she rose into a hunch and hurried toward the grouping of trees. The fog curled like fingers through the close-knit trunks, but she could see why the person with the lantern took their time. Even without a light source, there was enough glare from the reflected moonlight to show her where the ground ended. She could hear the trickle of water below the mangle of roots. Apparently, the trees worked together to create a makeshift walkway over a narrow stream feeding into the river. Looking ahead and between the trunks, she found the moving lantern again. The person hadn't gotten far. Glancing down, she moved her left foot out and placed it upon the nearest root. Testing its sturdiness, she then shifted forward, giving all of her weight to that one root before slipping her right foot onto the next one. Bracing herself with both hands upon the surrounding trunks, she pushed herself onward, having to feel for the next root. Touching the last tree of this grouping, she looked up again to see the person had reached the corner of that larger building. Propelling herself away from the trees, she landed upon solid ground again and crept forward. The ground wasn't mushy here, seeing as the bank was several feet above the river now. She wasn't so worried about her footfalls as she closed in on that building. However, she heard when the sound of the person's footsteps changed. Once more, they had lowered the lantern near their feet. This was to confirm the arrangement underneath them, apparently. Again, Claire saw why. Something like the docks in front of the shacks was established in front of this building as well. From what she could see, though, the boards weren't fashioned together to make one complete walkway. The person paused, looked up from their feet, and focused on the first window ahead of them. Claire stopped and squatted down, waiting. The person leaned forward slightly, as though trying to get a better view inside the shack. From this distance, Claire couldn't hear any voices from within. There had to be someone, or else. The person straightened, looked ahead, and then started tiptoeing forward. Every so often, they would glance through the window. Claire still didn't hear any voices inside. The top portion of the person was engulfed by the interior light, but still, they continued to tiptoe on by, glancing through the window occasionally. It wasn't like they were walking right up next to the building, but they didn't choose to walk along the edge of the bank either. Since they were sneaking by, Claire couldn't hear their footsteps anymore. Slipping out of the light from the first window, they kept tiptoeing across. Claire decided to ease up to the corner of the building and crouch there. Despite the fog hanging like smoke, she was able to get a better look at the way the boards were arranged. They weren't placed randomly like she thought. Instead, they made a complete artificial border taking the place of the edge of the bank. It matched the length of this structure, but the width didn't expand to touch the front wall. From the edge, the pattern was as haphazard as the previous grouping of trees. Disregarding that, she turned her focus on the first window, hoping to hear any type of noise inside. Getting nothing, she noticed that the person ahead was now passing in front of the second window, being captured by the light. They were still tiptoeing, making occasional glances inside. Okay, Claire thought, so this wasn't their destination. Yet, why did they need to sneak by? She stayed low and decided to creep along the front wall. Passing underneath the first window, she spared a moment to listen for any voices. She almost stopped when catching the hint of someone mumbling. Not wanting to give herself away, she continued on and arrived at the shabby front door. The metal hinges were rusted and glistening with moisture. The wooden surface was just as mildew-ridden as the rest of the wall. The person escaped the light of the second window. They straightened from their hunched posture and started to speed up, but they were still tiptoeing. Claire scurried over to that window. Before leaving it, she scooted to the right side of it, faced the building, and then slowly rose from her squat. She set herself up to where only her left eye would be able to peer inside. Once she was just above the bottom sill, she froze. This wasn't someone's home. Several round tables stood about a large room. There was a lantern sitting in the middle of each one, and they were all lit. In the back, a countertop stretched from the back right corner and stopped near the middle of the wall. Behind it were tall wooden shelves, all cluttered with old glass bottles and jugs. There were even beat-up-looking cups made of some cheap-looking metalwork. A few dishes were sitting along the counter, but there was no one standing behind it. From what she could tell, everyone was sitting at a single table in the middle of the room. There were 4 of them, all hunching forward in their chairs, elbows on the table. They were all men. She could see the face of the one sitting on the left. His brow had sunken low over his dark eyes. His mouth was frowning, but he wasn't the one speaking. He was looking at the guy directly across from him. It looked like the other guys were focused on the same man. She could still hear a whispered mumbling. They were all dressed in raggedy shirts and trousers, not exactly bed attire. What type of dark secrets could they be sharing at this late hour, she wondered. Squatting back down, she looked to her right, finding the person with the lantern. They just passed that end of the building when a shadow thrust from the left, snagging them. The lantern was flung upward as the person was yanked from their path to disappear around the corner, taking their light source with them. Claire remained in her squatting pose, her eyes wide. Studying the edge of the building, she thought she could see the faint glow of the lantern. Either the person wasn't taken that far, or the lantern was dropped, though she couldn't recall hearing it landing on the ground. Imala was thorough in her tactics, or so she had hoped. Hurrying away from the window, she slipped up next to the edge of the building. Expelling a breath, she leaned forward, peering around the wall. Imala was there, smiling in her direction. Claire could see her face because the lantern was in her left hand. Her right hand was over the person's mouth. She had pinned them against the side of the building. They rolled their wide eyes in Claire's direction. It was a strange sight, seeing as both Imala and this woman were the same height. Maybe the shock of being snatched into the shadows still had her, because the woman's arms were down at her sides, pressing her hands flat against the wall. Claire's shoulders sagged. "Here?" she whispered. "What?" Imala snickered. "Figured you were growing impatient." "What gave you that idea?" Claire grumbled, stepping up to Imala's side. She then stretched her left arm forward, taking the end of her cloak in her grip, and pressed her knuckles against the wall near the woman's head. Closing off their view of the river, the fabric was thick enough to snuff out the majority of the lantern's light from that direction. Anyone passing by wouldn't notice a thing. Both she and Imala leaned toward the woman. "Got a question," Imala whispered. "There wouldn't happen to be a hot spring nearby, would there?" The woman squinted her eyes, wrinkling the middle of her brow as she glanced between the two. Then her eyebrows shot up, as though suddenly aware of something. She expelled a sigh through her nose, and her body relaxed. "Humph," she mumbled against Imala's palm. Imala grinned at Claire. "Did she just laugh?" "I think you can take your hand away," Claire offered. "Yeah?" Imala responded. Considering the woman a moment, she noticed her eyes were calm but fixed upon Claire, like some gesture of confirmation. "Okay," she said, and slowly removed her hand. She had revealed a smirk on the woman's lips, who now looked her way. "Got an answer for us?" Imala asked. The woman's lips broke to show her teeth. She was slumping against the wall now, dressed in some dark robe-like garment, covering her from neck to ankles. The fabric was as raggedy as the clothes those men were wearing in their hushed meeting. Glancing between both of them again, the woman whispered back, "How many have you contributed?" Claire didn't see Imala smirk. She just held her gaze with the woman. Thinking quickly, Claire responded, "What if we're new here?" The woman's grin shrank some, but she didn't look away as she answered, "Haven't been told the cost, but you're here anyway." Her grin returned. "What type of arts do you already know?" Imala and Claire regarded one another. Turning back to the woman, Imala said, "Why don't we speed things up? Do you know a man by the name of Samson?" Claire started to glare at her, but she stopped herself, curious as to what the woman would say. That grin shrank once more, but didn't entirely disappear. Studying Imala, the woman smirked and asked, "Are you Imala, then?" "Psh!" Imala snickered, turning to Claire. "How lucky is this?" "So there is a hot spring nearby?" Claire asked. "Let me guess," Imala jumped in. "That's where you were going." The woman's eyelids grew heavy as she smiled at her. "I've contributed enough for tonight." "And what happens tonight?" Claire asked. "My first night," the woman responded, dazed. "I bring the last of my payment to begin my own personal series." "Series?" Claire said. "Are you prepared?" the woman asked them. "It takes several nights in a row. Can't miss a single one. But you should be able to prove your dedication by collecting your payment." "Yes, before anything, there's the payment. Surely, if you can stomach that trial, then you're ready for the rituals." "So, Samson," Imala stopped her. "He finished everything." Grinning, she added, "Right? He's already beyond." Claire rolled her eyes in Imala's direction, remembering their conversation in front of the pool back at the fort. The woman tilted her head, her brow furrowing again. Then her dazed grin returned. "Did you see him? Did he look?" "Not like you or I," Imala said. The woman's grin stretched. "And what did he do with what he became?" "He was free," Imala whispered. Claire glanced at her. The woman stared, and then exhaled with a wide smile. "I remember him talking about that a lot. Freedom. It's not a bad thing to have." "That's what you're going for?" Imala asked. The woman rolled her eyes up in thought. "This place," dropping her eyes back to them, "it's out of the way, forgotten, but we're not free. We're hidden because we hide." Her grin returned. "I don't want to hide anymore." "Neither do I," Imala said. The woman focused on her. "Then maybe," she said, "this will be the last place you'll have to." "Not here," Claire said, the woman turning to her, "but a hot spring." Still grinning, the woman responded, "It's not far." She looked at Imala and extended her hand toward the lantern. Imala handed it over. The woman then pushed away from the wall and stood upright between them. Bringing her free hand up, she pressed her index finger to her lips, glanced between them, and then walked toward the bank. Imala and Claire exchanged a look. Imala snorted and stepped away. Claire took her knuckles from the wall, letting her cloak fall back into place, and she followed after them.